When most people think of Henry VIII's heirs, they recall the infamous Bloody Mary or the formidable Elizabeth II, but hidden beneath the shadow of those towering figures was another, a boy whose brief, chilling reign revealed a darkness that even his brutal father might have found unnerving. Edward VI, crowned at the tender age of 9, began as a symbol of hope, but his transformation from a precocious, bookish prince into one of England's most coldly authoritarian monarchs would haunt the Tudor dynasty and leave a scar on the nation's soul. His birth in 1537 was celebrated as the end of dynastic turmoil. After years of disappointment and political scheming, Henry VIII had at last secured a legitimate male heir. But Edward's arrival came at a tragic price. His mother, Jane Seymour, died just 12 days after childbirth, elevating her son's importance and Henry's desperation to godlike proportions. From infancy, Edward wasn't raised as a child, but as the kingdom's salvation. Wrapped in velvet and watched by guards, he grew up in a world devoid of innocence, a lonely artifact of divine purpose. Unlike his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, who faced their father's wrath and rejection, Edward knew only praise and deference. Haunted perhaps by guilt over his treatment of his daughters, Henry lavished affection on his son, bordering on obsession. Yet this love was conditional, shaped by a vision of Edward not just as a prince, but as the architect of a Protestant utopia. The boy was entrusted to the kingdom's most elite minds, not to nurture curiosity, but to indoctrinate purpose. His tutors weren't merely scholars, they were radical Protestant zealots, hand-picked to mold him into a God-ordained warrior of reform. By 6, Edward was consuming dense theological tracts and dissecting arguments against Catholicism with unnerving precision. His education wasn't just elite, it was weaponized. His chief tutor, John Check, a brilliant but unyielding ideologue, framed every lesson, from philosophy to politics, through the prism of Protestant supremacy and divine kingship. By the age of 8, Edward wasn't just parroting ideas, he was formulating arguments for the death of those who dared oppose his vision of God's truth. What made Edward's upbringing truly perilous was the fusion of intellectual sophistication with complete emotional deprivation. He could out-argue scholars on theology, yet had never built a sandcastle, laughed with peers, or felt the sting of shared vulnerability. Revered by adults, untouched by childhood, he was becoming something far more dangerous than a mere prodigy. When Henry VIII died in early 1547, the crown passed not to a seasoned statesman, but to a pale, serious-eyed 9-year-old, a boy taught to believe he was God's chosen vessel on earth. England, still smouldering from its break with Rome, now belonged to a child molded by zealots and trained to see compromise as heresy. Though officially governed by a regency council led by his uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, the boy king wasted no time asserting himself. From his earliest council meetings, Edward shocked seasoned men by interrupting them mid-sentence to deliver lectures on doctrinal purity. His tone wasn't inquisitive, it was absolute. What troubled observers most wasn't the king's precocity, but the speed with which he seized control. Within weeks of his coronation, Edward was personally reviewing death sentences, debating the spiritual merit of each execution like a scholar grading theological essays. And he seemed to enjoy it. Courtiers whispered about his strange delight in issuing punishments, not out of cruelty for its own sake, but from a chilling conviction that he was cleansing England in the name of divine justice. Smiling as he signed death warrants, Edward appeared pleased, as if validating his tutor's teachings through real-world consequences. What began as political zeal quickly curdled into something more disturbing. He would fly into rages, tantrums of righteous fury, when advisors dared suggest religious moderation. To Edward, any compromise with Catholic remnants was a betrayal not just of policy, but of Christ himself. One episode became infamous when a councillor proposed allowing Catholic nobles private worship. Edward hurled his inkwell across the chamber and screamed that such weakness would bring God's wrath upon the realm. But this wasn't just childish behavior. It was fanaticism cloaked in royal authority. In private, his obsessions took even darker turns. While other boys his age chased dogs or jousted with wooden swords, Edward pored over grisly accounts of the Spanish Inquisition, annotating margins with observations about torture efficiency. His servants discovered unsettling drawings in his chambers, images of floggings and fire, carefully labeled with commentary about which methods best encouraged confessions. These weren't idle scribbles. They were the notes of a boy becoming a master of state-sanctioned suffering. More than a monarch, Edward had begun to see himself as a purifier, an avenger of God's truth, tasked with burning out England's spiritual rot, even if it meant sacrificing mercy, family, or reason. And in that sacred mission, there was no room for compromise and no patience for dissent. By the age of 10, Edward VI was no longer simply a precocious monarch. He was the ideological center of a cold, calculated regime. His court had become a theater of holy severity, where mercy was weakness, and loyalty meant obedience not to the crown, but to a puritanical vision of God's will. In public, Edward appeared composed, regal, almost delicate, a sickly child clad in silk and gold. But behind closed doors, he was drafting sermons demanding the eradication of Catholic influence, some of which were read in pulpits across the kingdom. He wasn't just absorbing religious doctrine, he was shaping it. His intellectual prowess was now fused with something far more dangerous: a vindictive streak. Those who displeased him, even in trivial ways, became the targets of humiliating punishments designed less to correct behavior and more to assert dominance. When a young page accidentally spilled wine on the king's writing, Edward ordered the boy to stand for hours in the courtyard while courtiers pelted him with rotting food. The king watched from above, noting the servants' reactions with an eerie calm, more like a scientist recording results than a ruler meting out discipline. Worse still were Edward's personal journals. Within them were not meditations or reflections, but cold observations of pain, fear, and religious defiance. He wrote about executions with the same tone he used to describe the weather, noting which methods elicited better results. Even his own family wasn't spared his theological scrutiny. Though raised alongside Mary and Elizabeth, Edward, once crowned, saw them not as sisters, but as pawns or threats. Mary, with her unwavering Catholicism, was an enemy of Christ. Elizabeth, a fellow Protestant, was more useful than beloved. When their uncle, Thomas Seymour, tried to curry Edward's favor with gifts and affection, the boy saw only manipulation. And when Seymour was later accused of treason, Edward didn't hesitate. Not only did he support the execution, he watched it from his window, silent and unmoved, scribbling notes on the process. By age 12, the boy who had once clung to his tutors now overruled his counselors. He designed laws, dictated sermons, and intensified religious policy with a fervor that alarmed even his most zealous allies. His Protestant reforms were no longer aspirational. They were enforced with terror. Attendance at church was compulsory. Informants, neighbors, even children, were rewarded for denouncing hidden Catholics. Worship was no longer personal, but prescribed word for word, gesture for gesture, by royal decree. Edward had built not just a kingdom, but a surveillance state of the soul, a world where prayers could be treason and silence could cost you your life. As Edward grew older, so did his hunger for control, not just over laws and lives, but over the minds and souls of his subjects. His vision of England was one where obedience wasn't enough. He wanted conformity of thought, enforced by fear. He issued detailed mandates, not just for public worship, but private prayer, outlining what to say, how to kneel, even what to believe. Deviations weren't sins, they were treason against both the crown and God. Edward personally designed networks of informants. Neighbors spied on neighbors. Children were encouraged to report their parents' secret Catholic devotions, and many did. The king read their accusations with fascination, sometimes calling the informers to court to elaborate on their claims. Punishments weren't random, they were tailored. A housewife caught reciting the rosary might be shamed in public. A nobleman refusing Protestant rites could face prison or the gallows. And Edward, not his advisors, reviewed each case, often increasing the severity of sentences himself. This wasn't governance, it was spiritual warfare. His court turned into a crucible of paranoia, where devotion to the king's religion mattered more than loyalty to the realm. Officials who hesitated were replaced. Those who showed compassion risked ruin. Edward had created something terrifying, a child-run regime where faith was measured in cruelty and doubt was punished as betrayal. Now fully immersed in his holy crusade, Edward viewed even his own blood through a lens of doctrine and danger. Mary, his elder half-sister, wasn't just a Catholic. She was a living threat to everything he believed England must become. He referred to her in private writings as the bastard and Christ's enemy. Her existence wasn't merely inconvenient, it was intolerable. He spent hours devising legal and theological strategies to strip her of legitimacy or end her life. What began as succession anxiety escalated into obsession. Edward plotted mock trials, wrote confessions he intended to force her to sign, and imagined a final act of mercy, allowing her to be beheaded instead of burned. With Elizabeth, his Protestant half-sister, things were more strategic than sentimental. He didn't trust her, but he saw value. She could be a useful pawn in marriage negotiations, a vessel to secure alliances that would strengthen his ideological regime. To Edward, family was not about affection, memory, or kinship. It was a calculation, a question of utility and threat. If they advanced his vision of a purified England, they might live. If not, he would see them destroyed, no matter their bloodline. By age 13, Edward VI no longer simply issued orders. He controlled every lever of religious life. His court became a machinery of fear and purity, where even whispers of Catholic sympathy could end in imprisonment or execution. He established what was, in essence, a thought police network. Subjects were encouraged to betray one another, and those reports were sent directly to the boy king. Edward read them eagerly, sometimes summoning accusers for deeper accounts, not out of justice, but curiosity. He didn't merely approve sentences, he redesigned them. His journals from this time read like manuals of persecution, filled with notes on which punishments best fit which heresies. Floggings, public humiliation, imprisonment, and increasingly death became tools of religious correction. When traditional methods didn't satisfy him, Edward invented new ones. One priest who refused to renounce Catholicism was forced to march through London carrying a sign that read, "Enemy of Christ," while children pelted him with stones. The king watched the scene from his window, laughing and dictating observations to his secretary. This wasn't a detached monarch operating through distant advisors. Edward personally fueled the Inquisition he'd built, not reluctantly, but with imagination, precision, and satisfaction. As Edward's health began to falter in early 1553, His fanaticism only sharpened. Illness didn't soften his heart, it inflamed his resolve. He became consumed with a singular fear that his death would undo everything he had built. If Mary succeeded him, England would return to Catholicism. That possibility filled Edward not with sorrow, but with rage. His journals turned darker, his prayers more violent. He spoke not of forgiveness, but of purging every last trace of Catholic influence. Delirious with fever, he delivered rambling sermons to terrified courtiers, proclaiming it would be better to kill every Catholic in England than allow one to rule. These were not passing fantasies. In lucid moments, Edward began plotting a coup to bypass both Mary and Elizabeth. He aligned with John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, and together they devised a plan to install his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, as Queen. The conspiracy was vast and vicious. It called for the arrest or execution of both sisters, mass purges of Catholic nobles, and the rise of a permanent religious regime harsher than anything England had seen. Though his body weakened, Edward's hand scrawled page after trembling page of names, laws, and death lists, a dying boy drafting the blueprint for a Protestant dystopia. But Edward's plans for a Protestant empire were unraveling, not through rebellion, but through his own body's collapse. As summer of 1553 approached, his health plunged into grotesque decline. Contemporary accounts describe a horror show. His skin turned a sickly green, his breath fouled the air, his hair and nails fell away. Modern analysis suggests a brutal combination of tuberculosis and possible arsenic poisoning, perhaps administered by royal physicians in a desperate, misguided effort to cure him. The irony was cruel. The boy who had poisoned England with fanaticism was himself dying by poison. His physical torment only deepened his spiritual obsession. In between convulsions and hallucinations, he dictated sermons about the necessity of Catholic extermination. He wasn't seeking peace, he was issuing orders from a deathbed pulpit. Those around him began to fear not just for the king, but for what he might yet unleash. And still, Edward refused to surrender his vision. He begged his co-conspirators to carry on the plot even after his death, urging them to save England from Mary's wickedness. His final days were filled not with reconciliation or reflection, but with hatred, fevered prophecy, and the lingering stench of death. Edward VI died on July 6, 1553. But for weeks before, his body had been a decaying shell, a grotesque parody of royalty. His courtiers, hardened by Tudor cruelty, could barely stand to remain in his presence. The stench, the convulsions, the madness. It was as if his physical ruin mirrored the spiritual torment he had unleashed across his kingdom. He remained lucid enough to know what was happening, and that knowledge only intensified his desperation. There were no last confessions, no reconciliations with his family. His final hours were spent damning Mary and urging the continuation of his Protestant paradise. In those final breaths, he wasn't a boy afraid of death. He was a prophet demanding that others carry on his holy war. His last words, as recorded by witnesses, were not of peace or sorrow, but of hate, invectives against his Catholic sister, and pleas to God to punish England if she ever wore the crown. When death finally claimed him, there was a palpable sense of relief among his court, though no one dared say it aloud. The boy king, who had once been heralded as England's deliverance, had become its nightmare. And with his death, the machinery of repression he had built began to collapse. His carefully orchestrated plan to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne unraveled almost immediately. Without Edward's intense personal drive and authority, the conspirators hesitated, the nobles wavered, and within days, Mary marched triumphantly into London. Even many Protestants supported her. not because they longed for Catholicism, but because they feared what Edward's vision had become. Lady Jane was abandoned, the coup disintegrated, and the country braced for a return to a different kind of religious rule. But what Edward left behind was more than a failed conspiracy. It was a revelation of what happens when power is given to a child molded by ideology, deprived of empathy, and handed a crown before he's ever known human connection. His death ended the reign of terror, but it also left behind a nation shaken by what it had witnessed, and what it had barely escaped. Edward VI was buried with royal ceremony, but his legacy was not one of honor. The boy once hailed as England's salvation was now remembered, even by his allies, with unease. Behind the painted portraits and polished tomb lay the truth. For 6 years, England had been ruled by a child tyrant, a brilliant, isolated fanatic with unchecked power. In the immediate aftermath, his reign was quietly disavowed. His Protestant coup was dismantled, Lady Jane Grey discarded, and Mary took the throne, not only with Catholic support, but with help from moderates who had once feared her. Even among Protestants, there was a collective exhale. They had seen the edge, and Edward had nearly pushed them over it. The great irony of his rule was this: the boy who burned with righteous fury to purge Catholicism had, through his extremism, driven people back to it. Ordinary believers, repelled by Edward's harsh vision of Protestantism, now found comfort in the very faith he had tried to eradicate. Modern historians, peeling back layers of myth and propaganda, have uncovered a far darker figure than once believed. This wasn't merely a sickly boy manipulated by power-hungry advisors. Edward took pleasure in persecution. He personally designed systems of control and cruelty. His journals weren't innocent royal diaries, they were blueprints for repression. The so-called child king was, in essence, a brilliant young autocrat with the instincts of an inquisitor. What makes Edward's story so disturbing is not just what he did, but who and what he might have become. He was already building secret police, crafting surveillance laws, drafting mass execution orders. Had he lived to adulthood, England might have become a prison state run not by compromise or politics, but by holy terror in the name of one teenage boy's vision of God. His death, though tragic in its physical horror, may have been England's deliverance. For all the torment he suffered in his final hours, the convulsions, the poisoning, the hallucinations, there was never a moment of doubt or remorse. His last days were filled with bitterness, not redemption. Edward died exactly as he had lived, consumed by control, cloaked in righteousness, and utterly alone. In the end, his story is not just a cautionary tale about youth and monarchy. It's a warning about the corruption of ideology, the dangers of blind certainty, and the monstrous potential that can grow when absolute power is placed in the hands of someone too young to know what mercy even means. The boy king's greatest act of mercy may have been his death,